This is Joe Lawrence with the Pro Dairy team at Cornell University. Today we're going to be talking about corn silage harvest and some of the keys to making the most of this narrow opportunity that we have. This was presented as part of the Dairy Profit Seminar Series at the 2019 Empire Farm Days. And when we think about this topic, we really have one chance each year to get it right in terms of how we harvest the feed that we're going to be using for the next 12 to 18 months with our dairy farms. And this is always a challenge. It's a busy time of year, a lot going on, a lot condensed into a small time frame of when the corn matures. And then we come to 2019, which takes a lot of these challenges and increases the management we have to do to get through them and really make it as successful as possible. I like to start with this slide. It's borrowed from Dr. Kung at the University of Delaware, and it really points out very straightforward that to get excellent quality silage, we have to start with high quality feed and have excellent silage management. Certainly this year, just starting with high quality feed can be a challenge. We have a corn crop that's differing stages of maturity and has some of it was planted very late, and so the likelihood of it maturing before a killing frost is slim. So we have to deal with that on top of all of our other practices. So everything we can do to get that quality right to start with, and then certainly, where we do have some influences to manage the silage making and storing part of that silage management part and getting that right. And as I already said, this is condensed down into a very short time frame each year. We have a couple weeks to get this done, and oftentimes we have split-second decisions that can have long-lasting effects on feed for the next year. We may make the decision to harvest a field when it's too wet because of impending weather forecast or where we are logistically in terms of harvesting a certain field before we move to another section of the farm. If we don't have enough tractors or manpower to have adequate packing weight on if we're using bunk silos or drive over piles, kernel processing, length of cut, are we checking our inoculant applicators daily to make sure that nothing's plugged or we don't have any broken hoses and we don't chop a day's worth of forage without putting inoculant on it. So in general, there's several things we think about on any given year for planning for corn silage, and certainly thinking about what areas you have available for storage, whether you're using upright silos or silo bags or bunk silos, drive over piles. Do you have enough room for storage, and how are you going to store that crop so it can be used for the intended group of animals? So we want to try to avoid burying one feed under another feed because a certain quality feed is only valuable to us if it's available and accessible when we need it to feed a certain group of animals. We certainly put a lot of attention into preparing the choppers and making sure we have a proper length of cut and our kernel processor is working adequately. And then we can, we'll get into a little bit more here, estimating harvest timing, which is certainly going to be a big deal this year with the wide window for planting and the fact that even within some fields, we had to go back in and replant sections. Other things we think about each year is, trying to set up, related to predicting the harvest timing of fields, trying to strategize a harvest sequence and set up a program where we're going to store the feed. We know more and more that we understand the influence of weather on forage quality. Certainly starch content is, one is driven by just whether the crop actually matures or not. But we also know that adequate rainfall at pollination can affect ear development and therefore starch content. We want to harvest at the proper whole plant dry matter, And, we tend to talk about a range of 32 to 38% dry matter. 35, 36% really works well if you can hit that range, especially with uh, bunk silos and silo bags. And there's data out there showing that weather during the growing season can have an effect on fiber digestibility, especially rainy growing seasons and particularly rain in August seem to have a negative effect on fiber digestibility. So if we recognize that up front with the season we're having, then we can plan accordingly for when we start feeding that silage. Then we go from just the stuff we want to talk about every year in terms of good silage harvest to what happens in a wet year. So certainly inventory management is a concern. Are we going to have enough tons of feed? Certainly always a good idea to do inventories, but in a year like this, making sure you have enough feed for the right groups of animals on the farm is going to be very important. Determining what you have for current inventories, estimating what your yields will be, and what sort of inventories you'll have for the coming year. An opportunity for dairy farmers in a wet, late growing season like this is always to work with local grain farmers that if there's corn that may not make it for grain but could make it for properly matured corn silage, is there an opportunity there to bolster your inventories? And as we get later in the growing season, we want to be thinking about the implications of that wet weather early. Generally, when we have wet weather early in the season, the plants tend to not put down a deep root system. This makes them more susceptible to drought later in the season. It also makes them more susceptible to wind damage later in the season as we get into September and we have the chance for more heavy storms. Then if we jump to 2019, I would say the big thing here is we really need to be prepared to manage two distinctively different forages. So we have our corn silage that's likely to reach maturity, and that certainly, so that's our typical corn silage that we really want to be able to store and keep separate and feed to our lactating cows. And then a lot of farms have a fair number of acres that are unlikely to reach maturity and will likely be killed by a frost before they reach maturity. And with those crops, we really don't want to treat it like corn silage, and we don't want to mix it in with our good corn silage. We want to think of it as a different forage crop that may have value for non-lactating animals, and we want to think about how we're going to harvest and store that accordingly to be able to utilize it for those groups of animals. So this immature crop we have, how do we store it so that we can access it and use it for inclusion in certain diets on the farm? Anytime we harvest wet silage, we need to be prepared for excess leachate. And so some things we can do is change our length of cut can help reduce leachate. It's likely that with immature silage, kernel processing won't be necessary, and that's also another way that we can reduce leachate potential. And then if you do have a leachate collection system on your farm, it's really important to make sure that operation and maintenance procedures are up to date and that the system is ready going into this harvest season for the potential of having to handle excess leachate. This is especially important on farms that have a nutrient management plan and need to follow those plans accordingly. But it's also important for any farm, and we don't want to put silage in a place where the potential for the leachate to leave the farm is high. So even if we do have to put up wet silage or if we have to make a temporary pile, we want to make sure we put that in a place that's that we can contain the leachate and manage it accordingly. It's also good to remember that anytime we have a light frost, it often makes the crop look worse than it actually is. Generally, it takes 28 degrees for just a few minutes to completely kill the plant, or it takes 30 or 32 degrees for a few hours to do so. So when we get a our first light frost where the temperature just dips down into the low 30s for a short period of time, it'll often kill the leaves, but the plant itself will still be alive, the stalk and the ear, and that's where a lot of the moisture is. So when the leaves die, it can make the plant look very dry, and it's really quite deceptive because chances are with the stalk and the ear, it's still a very wet plant. So we don't want to jump the gun on a lightly frosted field and harvest it when it's way too wet, just because the leaves make it appear dry. So in terms of predicting silage timing, for a long time there's been a rule of thumb of 6 to 7 weeks from tasseling to silage harvest, and that's a pretty rough rule of thumb that it's I would argue has never worked really well, but I would say in a year like this it's especially challenging to use, and here's an example of why. So this is the number of growing degree days accumulated in 10-day increments throughout the growing season, and as we can see here, we really if we have corn that's tasseling say July 11th, it's capturing a lot of growing degree days from in those first few weeks after it tassels. However, if we have something that tassels, say August 11th, now we quickly get into September and start decreasing the number of growing degree days that we're getting each week through that time period. So by the time we get to the end of September, the beginning of October, it actually takes 20 days to accumulate the same number of growing degree days that we did in a 10-day period back in July and August. So with our late maturing crop this year, that 6 to 7 week rule of thumb really isn't going to work well for us. A much better way to approach this is to look at growing degree days from silking to silage harvest, and there's some work done here in New York that showed between 750 and 800 growing degree days needed from silking to silage harvest. Now it's important to realize that this work was done based on the crop reaching 32% dry matter, which we know is kind of our minimum dry matter that we want. And generally based on dry down rates at that time of year, we could be looking at another 4 to 6 days for it to go from 32 to 35% dry matter. So really that 750 to 800 growing degree days is our early indicator of when harvest will happen, and we're really talking potentially a week after that of when we hit the moistures we really want. And a light frost can actually slow that down. Again, even though the plant looks dry because the leaves are dead, it can actually slow down the dry down process because now you have a compromised plant that can't take in sunlight and isn't going to mature as fast as it would if it was still green. So something to keep in mind related to frost as well. So in the past, we had to do some digging through the weather records to figure out, how soon we might reach the 750 to 800 growing degree days. Now we have a handy new tool that I find quite useful from the Climate Smart Farming program at Cornell. And this tool was developed to monitor growing degree days from planting. So you can enter in your location by picking entering your address or picking a location on the map. In this case, you could enter in planting date and then look at the number of growing degree days you thought you would need from planting to harvest, and it'll provide you a target date for when you'll reach that number of growing degree days based on 15 and 30-year averages. Another use of this tool would be to put in that silking or tasseling date. So instead of putting in planting date, we could put in the date of silking, and then look at that 750 to 800 growing degree days from silking to silage harvest. This gives us a little more accuracy because it takes out any sort of fluctuation in the early season development that we get when we use growing degree day estimates for the entire season. Now we're narrowing it down to just the growing degree days needed from silking to silage. So this was a snapshot of looking at Seneca Falls, where the Empire Farm Days is held, and a tasseling date of July 29th. And based on this prediction, we would be looking at reaching 800 growing degree days around September 8th. So again, we'd be potentially, 4 to 6 days later than that to reach that 35% dry matter. And the other thing we can look at here is down in the bottom right corner, there's blue lines, and that indicates the number of days in the past 30 years that we've had a killing frost on that date. So we can see that the earliest, there was 1 year where there was a killing frost around the beginning of October. And so for this field that tasseled on July 29th, based on average growing degree day accumulation, we're pretty safe that it will mature for silage before a frost. However, if we look at that same tasseling date for a location in the North Country that doesn't accumulate as many growing degree days, we have the same tasseling date, the same target of reaching 800 growing degree days, but now we're getting out we're at the 19th of September to reach that 800 growing degree days, and then from there we're, again, 4 to 6 more days, so we're potentially out to September 25th for this field, and we see that there is a chance that we could start seeing a frost before those dates. So this is a useful tool to use and a useful way to use it in terms of, if you know the silking date of your crop, projecting out silage harvest. So now we'll shift gears to storing the silage, because regardless of what maturity it is when we're forced to harvest it, we have opportunities on the storage side to optimize its quality as feed. And really what we're talking about anytime we talk about silage storage is preservation of dry matter and preservation of quality. So we want to minimize any sort of dry matter losses, and we can do that by increasing density, utilizing inoculants, face management on bunk silos or drive over piles, certainly consistency at feed out, and really maximizing the amount of feed we can store in a given footprint has both economic and environmental benefits. So, anytime we talk about this busy time of year and the stress that goes along with it, certainly we want to start out with sending all ourselves and our employees home safe each day, and recognizing the dangers that come with the busy time of the season. We already talked about harvesting at the correct moisture and maturity whenever possible, retaining as much dry matter as we can, proper siting and construction of our storage areas, and then, again, can we separate these feeds by quality so that we can use it for the intended class of animals, whether that's lactating cows or non-lactating cows. Storage management is always important, but particularly with our bunks or drive over piles, they can be a very good way to manage feed, but we can also have really high spoilage losses if we're not careful. And feed out management, lastly, making sure we're keeping a good face and minimizing the risk of any spoilage at feed out. So when we talk about shrink, it's really a loss of dry matter, and that's feed that's not available to feed to your own animals or sell, and we can also lose quality. And that quality can come in the form of the loss of nutrients, or it can come in the form of having negative health consequences for the animals. We can't avoid the natural losses of dry matter through the fermentation process, but we can work to manage a lot of the other aspects of it to minimize those any losses above and beyond fermentation. One tool we have to make sure we're getting enough packing weight on our horizontal silos is a rule of thumb that we have of using 800 pounds of packing weight per ton of silage delivered per hour to the bunk. So using this card we've developed, if you had a delivery rate of 115 tons per hour and you followed that over till you got into the green, you'd be looking at 50 to 55 tons of packing weight to really adequately pack that silage. And something important to keep in mind related to that is that our pushing tractor, oftentimes only spends 50 to 60% of its time on the bunk silo. The rest of the time, it's sitting off to the side or waiting for a truck or a wagon to dump to push up the next load. So when we look at the weight from that pushing tractor, we only want to credit it for the time it's actually packing the bunk, which is never 100%. And, for a long time we talked about dry matter densities. Now we tend to talk more about as-fed densities, but really whether it's 15 pounds per cubic foot on a dry matter basis or 45 pounds per cubic foot on an as-fed basis, that's really a minimum we want to achieve. That shouldn't be our goal. That should be the minimum we want to see. And we know we can get up to 50 plus pounds on an as-fed basis, and that's both desirable and very achievable if we set our minds to it. And that's going to pay big dividends in our silage programs. One way to do this that doesn't cost a lot of money is just with making sure we get our packing layers as thin as possible. So we often talk about adding extra weight, and that's certainly helpful if it's needed. We can add concrete blocks to tractors. We can add a second tractor or a third tractor if we have the tractors and the manpower to do that. And that's certainly worth doing if we need that packing weight to keep up with the delivery rate. But if we want to look at what we can do with the same resources we have, if we take a fill rate of 250 tons per hour and a layer thickness of 6 inches and plug this into the University of Wisconsin's spreadsheet that will predict densities, we can see that with that 6-inch layer thickness, with that push tractor, 25-ton push tractor that's only spending about half of its time packing, we're only going to get a density about 12 pounds per cubic foot on a dry matter basis. And remember, 15 is really our minimum. So we'd have to add 2 pushing tractor or 2 packing tractors to get up to 15 with that 6-inch layer thickness. If we take the spreadsheet and we put in a 4-inch layer thickness with everything else being equal, now we can see just with that push tractor, we're up to 14 pounds. And if we add a second tractor, we can get up to 16. So with that thinner layer thickness, we can achieve a higher density with less tractors. But in this case, I would still be advised at least to have 3 tractors on the bunk, because I think that 18 number is really achievable and desirable to have. So, but look what you can do with those 3 tractors with a 4-inch layer versus a 6-inch layer. And then when it comes down to storing excess feed or storing different qualities of feed, maybe we don't have room in our traditional storage area for all this extra feed. So what are we going to do with the rest of it? And if we have to come up with a temporary location, we really want to think about what that location is. We'd like it to be high and dry. We'd like it to be away from surface waters to minimize the risk of anything leaving the location and getting into a ditch or a stream or something. And ideally, we'd use something like silo bags in this scenario. The pictures here are some silo bags that are sited in a field that is well drained and it's a ways from any surface water. The second picture is a drive-over pile that was put on the edge of a cornfield. It wasn't packed well enough. The plastic was put on it, but it wasn't covered well. And when it was fed out the following year, there was a lot of waste that went along with it. So we certainly want to keep that in mind as we think about temporary storage structures. So a couple of examples of how better management of our silage pays dividends economically. One, and this is actually a haylage example, but you could apply the same thing to corn silage. If we assume zero shrink, zero dry matter loss, and we needed 4,500 tons of feed, then using this example with yield and dry matter, we would need 380 acres to achieve that tonnage of feed for the season if we had zero shrink. Well, we know we're going to have some shrink. Usually up to 10% shrink is fairly unavoidable between fermentation losses and some very minor management losses. But where we can really get into trouble is if we get up into the 20-25% shrink. And to demonstrate this on an acre basis, if we take that 380 acres we need and assume we're going to have 10% shrink, which would be really under really good management, then that bumps that total up to 409 acres, or an additional 29 acres that we have to cover each year to get the feed we need. So that's reality, right? Really, we're talking about needing about 409 acres, 410 acres to cover those feed needs, because we know there's going to be at least probably 8 to 10% shrink. But if we get up into this number of 25% shrink, now we're looking at needing a total of 570 acres that we have to cover each year to get that same amount of feed. So that starts to become very significant in terms of the investment in the acres we're covering to get the feed we could get off fewer acres if we were minimizing our storage losses. Another way to look at this is what footprint do you need? Concrete for a drive-over pile or a bunk silo or the extra needed there is a significant investment for a farm. And a few years ago, we visited a farm that was considering building a new bunk because they had limited storage capacity. And overall, it was clean, well-managed farm. Bunks were covered with plastic, with tire-to-tire coverage on the plastic. It had a defacer, but they didn't have enough storage space to get them through the year. And so we did an assessment of what they had currently based on how much they were feeding, how many months worth of storage they had, and we measured densities. And what we found was on this 800 cow herd, their average density was only about 13 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot, and their shrink losses were in the neighborhood of 24%. And so they only had about 9.5 months worth of storage. So we started doing some calculations and said, what if we push that density up to 18 pounds? So using the same numbers, we pushed the density up to 18 pounds, and we assumed that by doing that, we could drop the shrink down to about at least 15% because we'd have a lot less spoilage. And by making those two changes, we now have in the same footprint for over 14.5 months worth of storage compared to the 9.5 months they currently had. So that's without pouring any other concrete. So that, when we start to think about the capital investment in concrete, plus from an environmental standpoint, if we're collecting all the rainwater that's falling on that feed storage footprint, then we can really work to minimize that by increasing our densities. And really the number one limitation here was packing weight. So the decision was pretty simple here, that they could rent a tractor and hire another person to run that tractor and to increase their densities. And that would be a lot better investment than pouring another bunk silo. Wrapping up here, mycotoxins have been in the news a lot the last couple of years, and I would add feed hygiene to this and recognize that mycotoxins are just one part of feed hygiene. We do know that when crops are under stressful conditions, if diseases are present, that stress can increase the chance of mycotoxins. So from that standpoint, the stress that we've experienced in 2019 could be an indicator of mycotoxin issues, but it's very important to remember here that there's no guarantee of when we won't get mycotoxins. First, we have to have a susceptible host, and then we have to have a disease that infects that host, and then we have to have conditions where that fungal pathogen that infects the host actually produces mycotoxins, which doesn't always happen. Even if the fungus is there, it may not produce mycotoxins. So we have to have all those conditions in place to even get mycotoxins. And so while it's a very hard thing to predict, it is important to keep it on your radar and work with your nutritionist to, to try to do some sampling and catch any potential issues. And like I said, mycotoxins are just one part of feed hygiene. We also have to think about yeast and other bacteria that may enter our feed. And if we're putting up an immature crop that we're worried may not ferment correctly, it's an important place to think about this, because if we have improper fermentation, it increases the chances that we could have some problems, and oftentimes those problems present themselves in terms of less stable feed at feed out. So when we reintroduce oxygen to the feed and mix it into our TMR mix, we wake up those bad bugs that might be in there, and that can cause excess heating and spoiling of our feed. It can also cause palatability issues and health issues with cows. So we need to be thinking about feed hygiene in general, with mycotoxins being part of that. And part of that is forage testing. So we can forage test both for quality parameters as well as feed hygiene parameters. And I think taking samples of green forage and sending them in is a really useful investment, because it offers some pre-screening and to give you a good idea of what you're going to get into later in the year. Certainly having an analysis of your fermented feed becomes more important later in the season. Later, as you begin to feed out that material, you really want a fermented sample to balance your ration with. But those green samples can give you an opportunity to know what to expect, both from a quality standpoint and what group of animals you want to feed that to, and also from a hygiene standpoint, are we risking having mycotoxins or having fermentation issues? So with that, I'll end this talk here. My contact information is provided here if you have any follow-up questions, and good luck with the 2019 harvest.